Welcome to Good Goodbyes, the Funeral Facts podcast. We are really glad you found us. In this podcast, me, Simon, a funeral director,
and me, Tina, I'm an independent celebrant.
We're going to discuss all things funeral in an informal space to demystify what happens when we say goodbye.
Based on your questions and queries, Si and myself are two industry professionals that are going to chat through the hows, whats and wherefores. We actively work in the funeral industry in Devon in the UK. So, we hope you enjoy the episode ahead. Welcome to Good Goodbyes. Hello listeners, welcome to this guest episode of Good Goodbyes. It's Tina here and I'm with Imran Nazerali. So in a moment, I'm going to ask Imran to introduce himself, but today we're going to be talking about being a carer, having conversations with family members about their death and dying, and also some of the work that Imran is doing where he's based in London. So Imran, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Hello.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to be here and to chat with you, Tina.
Oh, absolutely lovely. So tell me a bit about you, what you're doing at the moment in the world of work, and why we both thought it'd be a good idea if you appeared on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am I'm a designer by trade. I started off over a decade ago as a kind of product designer, making furniture and kind of old school kind of product design, and transitioned into the world of people-centered design, which is around which is really about kind of designing products, services, or anything really, but with people that is going to be impacting, or with people that it's going to be used with. So really making sure that they're at the heart of the design process, and that they are kind of co-authoring and owning and steering the direction of projects, and worked in various different projects all around kind of social impact. And now I'm at the Helix Center, which is a kind of research lab and design research and design lab, co-founded by the two universities. It's the Imperial College London and the Royal College of Art, and we're kind of located out of St Mary's Hospital. And that was how I think we got connected. I'm working on a project around mental health for carers, lay carers, supporting people close to them towards the end of their life, and looking to understand what we could design with people. That could be a kind of product, a toolkit, a game. It could be anything really, but be shaped with kind of carers to essentially help better mental health and well-being outcomes when they're taking care of somebody close to them. And so that's how I found, was looking all over online at kind of different communities around death and end of life. And you had kindly posted on one of my posts, actually. I was doing a bit of a recruitment for some kind of face-to-face research with kind of carers to understand the problem space a bit better, and you reached out, and it was such a pleasure to hear from you. And we spoke before, and it was really, really, really lovely to hear that also you had experience around the kind of style work that I've done around people-centered design. And I'm based out of London. I'm in northwest London, or North London, in East Finchley. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. That's really good, because I think we will definitely put links in the show notes for everybody who wants to find their way to you, Imran, and find out a bit more about the work, and they might even want to contribute in some way. If you're listening to this and you have cared for somebody, or you had thoughts while you were going through a period like that, because a lot of people who listen to Good Goodbyes may well find themselves caring at a distance or very close to people who are end of life and going to die shortly. So yeah, it's good to connect, isn't it? And it's good to think about, on a practical level, what might help people. And the bit that you and I kind of felt very familiar to me was times when I, as a nurse in my background, worked in a unit supporting people with dementia, and we didn't have, the spaces didn't feel right for the folks who were living with dementia. And so we talked to them and their families, and we got so many ideas, such a rich pot of ideas that we would never have come up with all those ideas on our own. And so it's just really important to, the terminology nowadays is people talk about lived experience, but, you know, being with people who actually have had those experiences. We can only guess at it, can't we? But for each and every one of us, it's different. So I know for you, Imran, you have had also a personal experience, which kind of makes this, I guess, more meaningful for you.
Yes, absolutely. So I was or had experience rather my father passing away last year. In It was the 2nd of August it was, but he had a kind of terminal lung condition. I think it was like lung fibrosis, and I think he was diagnosed. It must have been about I want to say 2014 or something around that time. And I think people with this condition, I think generally the kind of lifespan is around 3 to 5 years. But he was quite luckily put on a kind of a trial medication, which kind of extended his life a bit more. But at the beginning of last year, it was quite clear that yeah, his body was deteriorating, and to the point where it wasn't able to leave his house, or was just very weak. He was on oxygen tanks, and so yeah, it was about 7 or so months, that he was engaging with palliative care teams, and that me and I have two older brothers, were kind of all kind of chipping into kind of care with him, along with his kind of partner as well at the time. And so yeah, it was such a profound experience, I feel like, for me. I mean, it's you always, I mean, people always assume, or at least I assumed that one would outlive their parents. And even so, in the back of the mind, I kind of like thought, this is, time is going to come, and it doesn't make it any easier when it does come. But what it did was the support that I had with my family, and also I suppose my dad was in, like, physically he was declining, but mentally he was there, up to the last few days. And a lot of that meant that we could have meaningful conversations. We could talk about things that he wanted, and talk about things that he had kind of planned for us after he had passed, in terms of businesses that he had running, accounts that he had, all finances, and stuff like that. And even though they were painful to talk about at the time, it really, really helped when that kind of time had come and we had a better understanding. Maybe not an entire picture, but we definitely had a much better understanding if we hadn't talked about anything at all. And so, having gone through that, and now working in this space, I think at the time I started this role at Helix, it was in November, and as I mentioned, Dad passed away in August. And like, at the time, I didn't actually realize how lucky I was, and how
Mm.
lucky we were to have had such a good goodbye. Not to reference the reference your podcast, to have such a good goodbye, and how much of a difference that made. And now, when I'm talking to people with lived experience and practitioners in this space, and really hearing and seeing, like, all the different challenging experiences that people went through, whether it was their parents or grandparents, and understanding all those different barriers that could have been in the way. Another thing was that he was at home for the entire time, which made a massive difference. And so all of these things, like, when I reflect back, actually, just how, it sounds weird to say, but how lucky we were, and how wonderful that experience was to what it could have been. And that, I think, has helped me tremendously. I don't think I would have even been able to work in this space to the best I can be, or being able to work in this space, I think, if it hadn't been such a good end. So yeah, that had happened, and I had my own health experiences last year. Then was Dad had his health experience. There was a lot of engaging with healthcare, and so when this role came up with it, I thought, what, I better go for it. It seems like so serendipitous. And it just so happened that this project on the life was there as well.
Yeah,
Happened
kind of
yeah.
the writing is on the wall, isn't it? So they say. I mean, I was listening to what you were saying then, and a few things were popping into my head. One is this idea that when we lose a parent, kind of like society in general, I think, kind of goes, oh, well, that was going to happen. No, generally speaking, people outlive their parents. That's the natural order of things. And of course, that is true. But they are the one person. I came across a very heartfelt little social media post from Nicola Kidman the other day, the actress.
Mm-hmm.
And she's lost her mum. Her mum was in her 80s. And it was a very vulnerable post because she was basically saying she was the one who knew everything. She was one of the few people who'd been there for the whole of my life, all of it. So we might lose other people, and they may or may not have been there for the whole of our lives. Maybe they're older siblings, who knows who they are, but not necessarily been there for the whole of our lives. I mean, our parents are that anchor to the whole of our lives. And so I think for some people, although we know it's the natural order of things, something in us, just that loss of a person who knew you the whole of your life, it feels like a significant thing. And just because someone's been around a long time, well, there's even more years to miss and more time with them, you know. And a lot of us might say, well, it's never enough. And sometimes it feels like that. So I was very struck by what you said about that, because I've come across that debated quite a lot on end of life forums.
Yeah.
The other thing that I was thinking as you were talking was those conversations, which it sounded like were so useful, you know, made the whole process kind of as good as it could be, so to speak. Who was the most comfortable talking about it?
It was actually my dad. He was the most comfortable, and I think I can't speak for my brothers, but I know for me certainly it was very painful to hear about funeral arrangements, and he wanted to be cremated. He wanted the cheapest coffin because he was going to be cremated anyway, and he was discussing about other kind of business and financial stuff that he had going on, and I mean at the time it was like it was quite unbearable for me to hear. Like many times where I burst out crying, and you know
were you tempted to stop him, Imran? Were you? Because I can imagine a lot of people are listening and thinking, oh, I don't know even if I could be part of a conversation like that. So how did you manage that for yourself? Were you tempted to stop him, or how did you manage it? Obviously you were upset and you allowed yourself to be upset, but how did that work for you?
I mean, I kind of just broke down a bit. I cried a lot. And so he actually was comforting me. It's okay. It's gonna happen. I think the fact that he had come to terms with his illness and he knew that it was going one way, that that kind of gave him the strength to be able to talk about stuff, because the thing with my dad, I mean, and with a lot of people's parents, I mean, like he cared for us so dearly. He bent over backwards for us. He really, really was such a nurturing father. And so I think what he realized before I had kind of realized in this stage was like, if I don't have these conversations, they're going to be much hurt later on. And so there were times where I said, when he did mention about funeral, and when he mentioned about like the non-resuscitation clause or something like that, and I even remember him saying that. I was like, Dad, but what are you doing? Why have you made that decision without us? Why are we talking about? I said, we don't need to talk about this right now. And he goes, listen, it's going to happen, and it's okay. And it was, I think his strength helped me, kind of listen a bit more. But it was really difficult. And there were times I wanted to stop him, but also, I'm the youngest out of the three of my brothers. And also with them, they were a lot stronger than me. At least I don't want to speak for them, but that's at least how I was perceiving it.
It looked outwardly, to you.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that, I think, I was the real baby in that moment. And I don't think I remember saying, Dad, don't, we're not talking about this anymore. I think it was just like, I don't want to talk about this. And, and he persisted to, really, which was,
it is
really good.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you said that, because I think our listeners listening to you say that, a lot of people I'm sure will identify with this. And, throughout my nursing career, it's been one of the things I've really tried to encourage families to do, because and the person who's best ever written about this is Catherine Mannix. I think she's incredible. She's a consultant in palliative care. She writes very honestly about having these kind of conversations. And in my world of nursing and palliative care, there was a lot of language like they are tricky conversations, they're challenging conversations. And actually, her language is different. She calls them tender conversations because it's an absolute acknowledgement that this is a tender moment. It's has a frisson of discomfort to it. It's probably something we don't want to say out loud. But in the moment of holding the space to let the person say the stuff, it is tender and loving, and it helps a lot. And I think when I've seen families push back quite strong, either by physically removing themselves from the room or just saying, please, can we not talk about this? It's too upsetting. Then it actually makes it harder for the person if the person dying is the person trying to have the conversation, because they're pushing against that resistance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like you said, I think that also, even though in those moments, I was selfishly thinking about myself and what I wanted to hear and what I didn't want to hear. But, I think in the back of my mind, there was that realization as well, is that, you know, this is probably the hardest for him. And he's doing a good job of trying to communicate with us. And so if I try to stop him, I kind of felt like, I want to let him say what he wants to say, whether I'm ready to hear it or not, because that was a big part of it was that, like, I didn't want him to feel like it gets to a point where now he can't talk about it. If he's unable to, if something progresses really quickly and then he hasn't said what he had to say, and being left without that dignity in some way and being heard. I mean, even if we weren't to listen, I could see that the fact of him saying it was like, he was a very methodical person, and it was just like he sat us down. It was very proper, and it wasn't like just on, we were chilling on the couch and we were, whatever, and he's brought up. It was like, come on, guys, let's get together, and I have some things that I need to share with you. We've got to talk about this and we've got to talk about that. And so, that, he wasn't very much of a person who shared much anyway. He was a man grown in the 50s who had migrated to boarding school when he was like 6 years old. He had a lot of troubles sharing anything. There's so many things that we didn't know about him, or he'd ever talked about or shared about himself. And so the fact that he is the one who initiated this conversation about something that's very difficult. And I can't imagine having to do that with my children. If I'd had children, and to think about having that conversation, it must have been tenfold difficult for him to say rather than for me to listen to. And so, that was important for me as well, to let him say that, because it felt like, exactly as you said, it would take away from his experience as well. And I didn't want him to leave feeling like he hasn't said his piece in some way, or even if we listened or not, I don't think he might. I think he just wanted to say it, to say, I've done it. I've done my part. I've told them, whether they've listened or not, like, I've got it off, and I've done the best I can.
Yeah. And words, they mean so much, don't they? Words, they're so important. And I mean, in my world of work, and my life view, it's definitely how impactful language is. And I think that what's happening at that end stage, having seen so much death, I think what's happening is not planning. I don't think that's necessarily always the right word. And I think when people talk about planning for your funeral, and we see these adverts on the telly, I think they're often like very put off by that. It's as if you're planning for a holiday. Are you going to end up having a death because you're planning for this thing? It can feel a bit wrong for people. But I think if it becomes preparation,
yes,
then that feels very different. And I think if you are the one doing the dying sooner than you thought, or in a way that you know is going to happen, which isn't the same for everyone, obviously, but if you're doing that preparation, it's part of it. How else do you prepare for this completely unknown thing? None of us know what's really beyond. We have our beliefs, but we don't really know. And so you're preparing for something which is the most unknown thing in our lives, actually. So if you can prepare, and I've come across this so often, there was a lady in the hospice, and she was younger with young children, and she was obviously the pivotal organizational kind of element of the family. I mean, she knew everything, like when the boiler would be fixed, when the MOT needed to happen on the car, all of the practical, pragmatic things. And I could see her trying to make inroads into conversations in her family about preparation. And people were closing these doors down, saying, no, 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 there's plenty of time ahead and we don't need to go there today. And out of a place of kindness.
Yeah.
And in the end, she said to me and some of the team, there's a blue folder. It's all going to be in there. And she'd sectioned it, and it was all in there. All of the admin, I guess, of running a home. But also what was in there was birthday cards for the years ahead for her children, a very heartfelt letter for her husband, preparation, because I think that made her feel some sense of control and also got her to a place where it's okay to go now because I have prepared them. So you're preparing yourself, aren't you? And you're preparing them, I guess, in running what you were saying about your dad.
Absolutely. And it's exactly as you said there, I was going to say that's that agency and control. You can, can really try to empathize and understand for it, particularly for people, who don't know how their condition might progress, who don't know when they might go, and who don't know what's in the beyond. That is the only thing that they've got control of, and I really, it's really hard to find that balance because, especially as family, at least what I felt was just like, and at times where if you mentioned something and I didn't really want to talk about it, because again, similarly on my side, I don't know when something's going to happen, and I don't want to spend the last time conversation that we're having to be talking about preparation. I want it to just be watching something together, to talk about something, to be eating food together, to do something that, and so balancing those different needs of the people involved, it's incredibly difficult. And I don't think there's a one size fits all, and there's not a mechanism to do that. There could be things to help have these conversations a bit better or facilitate these conversations a bit better or these situations, but it's really dependent on who people are and also what their relationships have been like before as well, and how many of you there are, so it's incredibly difficult, and again, it's one of the reasons why I was saying like we was just so like I felt, particularly as the youngest, so lucky that things went the way they were. It was it sounds so weird to say, but it was probably one of at least from what I've heard and what I've experienced, like one of the best ways to go from me as the youngest child going through that, because it was all, he wanted to talk and prepare, and had brothers there to also help support me when I didn't feel like I wanted to talk. I think if it was just me, maybe I would have been able to say, Dad, look, I can't, we can't talk about this. I don't want to talk about this, So yeah, it's a really difficult balancing act of those different needs, and you can't step away at those you can't step outside of your feelings in those moments. It's so overwhelming,
Yeah.
and you're just not used to being in that situation. It's in this case, a parent passing. If you're lucky enough to have two of them around, then this is the first time it's going to happen. It might happen again. It's only two times it's going to happen in your life, or maybe more if you've got different kind of different situations. But you can't. It's hard when you're in the thick of it to step outside.
And it's very life affirming, I would imagine. I'm not obviously having my own experience of this, but I think it's probably very life affirming for the person who's dying to see the emotion, because if there wasn't any emotion, it's as if like people can't show that they care. So I think there's something very real in that. Have you noticed in the work you're doing then, what's coming out of that feels relevant in the same way that your story does about your dad and you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think definitely around the kind of lack of clear communication and role alignment, and how that leads to kind of emotional strain, sorry, or conflict, or just friction, I suppose. And that can be both within families and also, let's say, with healthcare teams. So I've heard about people saying, that like the nurses are only addressing my mother, and they're not addressing me, and I'm also caring for my father, and so like again those understanding those kind of those roles and responsibilities, I think, like that, and what kind of part people are kind of playing in this, because a big part of that, again, like with the stuff that my dad was sharing, like there were things that he had specifically to say to my oldest brother, because he might be in charge of something when dad passes, and then there were different ways that he might say it to me. And so, these roles for us were actually assumed and probably correct in some way, but there has been things coming up around, the roles of family members, and maybe different ways to kind of care for that person. And if they're not kind of, if they're assumed, people can be, there might be a better way for us to work together here. And because those conversations don't happen, and it's unusual to have these conversations and segment roles to somebody's life as if it's a job, it's that has been that's definitely come up. And also, I think that something else has come up around was just like, the coordination and unclear kind of admin processes. And that kind of stops, or that delays people being able to grieve, and when things are kind of planned in advance or prepared for in advance. And, so that sometimes could even be just like things that happen automatically with different cultures. Sometimes in specific cultures, there's already a plan for what's going to happen, and that's relieved some pressure and strain as well. So those are the couple of the things that have been coming up. And yeah, I'm what I'd really like to explore a bit more as well. And it's something that, again, that I experienced with my dad, which was that, like, the moments of saying goodbye as well, Um, I mean, that was a really, really, I feel, that big part of my healing, and what's come up as well through some other people, that they were able to say what they needed to say, or not, or just be with that person in
because
silence.
it's so, I mean, this is opening up such a beautiful conversation for our listeners, I think, and I hope that they will be able to find their way to you in some form and share with you how this felt for them, if they are going through this or have gone through this, because I think sometimes it's not always the words. I towards the very end, for some people, if it is in a planned way, somebody isn't fully conscious, so the last thing to go, everyone tells us, is our hearing. So continuing to communicate, whether you're reading, listening to music together, whatever, it feels important. But I was in a home once, and they had the Monopoly board at the end of the bed, and they carried on this game of Monopoly for weeks. And then initially, because he loved Monopoly, initially he was involved, and then when he wasn't able to be involved and became less conscious, they carried on playing in the background, and that felt like including him in the goodbye. And they kept referencing him and saying, I walked in once, and they were saying, this game is never going to end because he's got all the hotels. You've got all the hotels. And they were talking to him, and it was kind of just a lovely moment. So that's definitely come up for me. And I think the other thing about roles is, once when I was a community nurse, I went into a home. I was told the previous day that the husband was very angry with the nurses. And I went in, and their front room was like walking into a hospital clinical area. There was clinical equipment all over the place. And they'd had a hospital bed brought in for ease of caring, I think. And I said, I understand you're really uncomfortable at the moment with things that are going on. Talk to me about it. And he said, well, look at this. He said, this isn't like my front room, like anyone's front room. He said, they come in, they've taken over, there's all this rubbish everywhere. And he didn't feel like he had any choice. And in the end, I think what we both decided together is that it just needed to be out of sight. So we got a valance, this very old-fashioned concept for some people who might be listening, but it's a special sheet that goes under your sheet and goes over the edges of your bed. It kind of hides what's under the bed. So it got this thing called a valance, and stuff went under the bed. So it was comforted by the fact that you weren't looking at it, all these clinical products. And that helped a little bit. And then we moved other things out of the way, and it felt a bit more like their front room again. And that felt good to him, like we weren't taking over. But then he said to me, and because we'd done all that practical stuff, I think he was in a place of just talking more honestly about how he was feeling. So he said, and the other thing, Tina, is, I didn't want to be a carer. He said, I'm her lover. We are lovers. We have never, and this is a long marriage. He said, we have never seen each other in the toilet naked. None of that. He said, we don't do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
He said, we are a private couple and we are romantic with each other. He said, and all of a sudden I'm supposed to be doing intimate things.
Yeah.
Caring things. And I thought, that's such a truth for him. And actually, lots of people would do that with a glad heart and they don't mind. For other people, it crosses a boundary for them in that relationship and they haven't chosen it. And it's assumed by all the healthcare workers around them that they're just going to dive in and become this physical carer.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's your dad, your sibling, your parent, your whoever it is, it might feel uncomfortable. And I do think it's one of these areas of that isn't explored.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I that resonates with me strongly. Towards the end of I think it's the last maybe few weeks or so. My dad he was able to kind of get to the bathroom with some assistance, and he wanted to kind of, make just getting help to stand up, and then he had his kind of frame that he would get to the bathroom. But it started to get into a point where he was passing. I think he passed out on the toilet once, and he just had such low energy. And so he would ask me, when I would go to his place and work from his home throughout the week, and I remember him asking me, like when I need to go to the toilet, can you just like he had a ensuite in his bedroom, like can you just come to my bedroom and I'm going to leave the door open. And in my mind, I kind of thought, there's no problem. No problem at all. If you want me to help you take you to the toilet, if you need me to do anything, no problem at all. But actually, seeing him and seeing him take his clothes off and seeing how much weight he had lost and seeing how difficult it was for that hit me so hard. The smell as well. These are things which I had assumed in my mind. He's my dad. It doesn't matter. It's but it was so tough to see that and to experience that. And I think that's to be like, even when I think back here now, that makes me so upset because again, the way I saw dad was always to the person you were talking about earlier. Like he was decision maker. He's the one you call if you need any help. He's the one to call for advice. He's the one to anything. And to see him like that, and I was fine in theory in doing it, and I didn't let him see that that I'm in a pain, but it was really, really hard to do from my side. I don't know about his side. I don't know if I think he maybe didn't mind as much. I think he was just like, I need someone to be there, like just it's fine. But for me, I was like, that really only until you just said it actually, it reminds me of how challenging I found that part of caring for him, and I can imagine that those you particularly if it's partners, because I always say as well, like as we were discussing earlier, when it's a parent and it's very sad, but my parents they'd been divorced for about 10 years or so prior to his passing. But we're still very, very close. My brother has children, so they're grandparents and we're always really close and whatever. And I often think like it must have been so hard when my mum used to come to visit him to see him like that. To have met him from a teenager, to have grown with him. He had many different challenges. He was quite he was a big character, and went through many different life challenges, and she was there with him, and and I think when I think about like all the stuff they came through, all the stuff they persevered through, but for me, I could not imagine as a partner to see your partner like that, and particularly, I mean, she never done any of the kind of like helping him go to the loo or anything. She would just come and talk, and that I like when I could see the pain from her as well. Like to imagine someone when you've set those, it's part of your identity as well as a couple or as a father and son or as whoever is, this is how you see that person, this is how you see them, this is the boundary you don't want them to see or cross or whatever. But in those times, you've got to do it. And so
it's what's kind of born out of necessity, isn't it? But I do think it's really healthy to talk about it, even if it's unavoidable. Even not necessarily with the person themselves, but you might talk about it with each other or with the care workers and say, look, if we could minimize this and I can be around in a different way, and I'd rather be son or daughter rather than carer. You can kind of talk those boundaries through a little bit.
Yeah. Because I can imagine it could be really very, very difficult for somebody to get that feeling out of their mind or get that memory out of their mind when the person passed as well. When you've seen someone as this,
and I guess the counterpoint of that, which is kind of about the good goodbye, is in the moment of goodbye, when you can talk to somebody and say like, oh, what are some of your favorite memories of our childhood, and what's the wisdom you want to leave behind for me, or if you've got preparation time, these are some of the favorite things I learned from you, this is my favorite recipe that you ever cooked for us. Really often it's the most simple things, but these are the gifts we give one another, these appreciations and gratitudes that we give each other. And I think when people think about saying goodbye, they get very frightened of the fact that they've got to just sit there and say the words goodbye and I'm going to miss you. But it could take so many forms. It could absolutely take the form that I'm talking of, where you're just almost thinking back and saying, look, this is what's been great about having you in my life. And this is what I've got from being with you. And then you don't have to take it to, and therefore being without you is going to be really hard. You don't have to necessarily go forward in time, but I think sitting with somebody and talking, and it's so lovely to reminisce together. That's such a pleasure. I mean, how many families do we all do that all the time? Do you remember last Christmas? Oh, do you remember that holiday when we did this? Or that time that so-and-so, ha ha ha, this happened. And so it's a comfortable place for people to be. And I think in that moment of holding those tender conversations about death, it doesn't always have to be, like you said, the drilling down into the preparation and the detail. Give yourself the time, is my message to the listeners, to have these, do the factual stuff and get that parked and on the shelf, so we all know, done. And then you can eat together, you can have joy together, you can go and see the sea together, you can do whatever it is that if you're able to do. So maybe for carers, that's the thing we can give to them, Imran, I think, is some balance around some of that stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's the, being able to reflect back, and, because I kind of thought that was that was the exact thing that I did when it was the day he was going to pass and he was no longer conscious, but they said you can still hear, and it was all those things, thanks, you did all this stuff, all these amazing things. I remember all the times you took me to the park, all the times you took me to Toys R Us, Pizza Hut every Saturday. Thank you so much. All the stuff you taught me to do, like it was very cathartic to be able to say that, and I kind of felt like it was something that I would want to hear if I had children, and or it's not even if you've had children, but anybody who you've been close with. The kind of stance I took was that I imagine that's the things you want to hear, is just like, thank you for all of this stuff, that your life has made my life different, better, taught me, guided me, and like that would be the most valuable thing I would want to hear, And so I think, being that, I think that gives back a lot, even if the person doesn't want to talk about it that much. I think that gratitude and just letting them know their value in this world, it's an assumption for me that it must help a lot for them, but also for yourself as well, to being able to share that, and to give such a beautiful present almost to that person, by sharing how their life has impacted you. I mean, I think that helped me a lot. I often think if I hadn't said that stuff, I would have always thought, I wish I'd said it. I would have wished I let him know, even if he didn't really respond. I would wish I could have let him know that, and that gratitude and stuff. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was just like, I even said some of the things, I was like, you mucked up a lot, but even those have taught me, all of those experiences, all you said verbally, all the things that you did well and the things you didn't do so well have all been valuable to me. That's life. not, to be realistic, it's not just that all, people hurt each other without meaning to in life, and people
Mm,
teach things to others by the things that they've done wrong.
mm.
It's still a lesson, and it's still valuable for you to experience. And so I kind of felt in that way. I didn't really want to hold back and just say all the good things, and I was like, it's been times where we've had really, really difficult times, but
Yeah.
thank you for showing me those times of difficult and conflict as well, because that's life, and it's taught me a lot about life, as well. So that I was so that really, honestly, when I think back at it, that moment was really, really helpful in my experience to be able to grieve and feel like I had done the best I could, or said the best I can to make him, you know, to say goodbye without saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Imran, honestly, we could talk for a long time about this, couldn't we? We could have several episodes, but I'm going to just stop on that lovely note, actually, of the gratitudes we can leave behind in that very authentic way that you've spoken of. I want to thank you so much for sharing all that you have. It's been deeply personal and just lovely to listen to you with the honesty that you've talked about it all. I will try and encourage people to find their way to you and see the work that you're doing, and I wish you well with that. But thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us all on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much for inviting me and for giving me the space to talk about this stuff. Again, talking about these things past the time is still healing, I find that when on this podcast or talking to others, so thank you for giving me that opportunity to be able to share. And hopefully, I hope listeners that can take away something that can maybe help them if they're experiencing it now through a difficult time, or if it's something that's going to be coming up, or if it's something that's happened. I hope that what we've talked about today can be helpful and soothing for anyone listening. So thank you so much, Tina, for the opportunity to be able to share.
No, it's my total pleasure. Thank you. Bye for now, everyone.
You've been listening to Good Goodbyes, the Funeral Facts podcast. Please do like, subscribe, comment and share. Drop any questions on our social media, on Instagram, or in the text option in the show notes.
Si and I are qualified professionals, but we always advise our clients to seek any additional support from medical practitioners if they need to. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay well and be kind to one another.